Microsoft just did something that no marketing campaign, no viral video, no tech influencer, and no grassroots advocacy movement has ever been able to do. They made switching to Linux mandatory for hundreds of millions of people, not by recommending it, not by endorsing it, by eliminating every other viable option. And the most remarkable part is that they didn't mean to. This wasn't a strategy to promote Linux. This was a strategy to sell new computers and Windows 11 licenses. It backfired spectacularly because the strategy depended on one assumption that turned out to be wrong. The assumption that people would rather spend $500 on a new computer than spend 20 minutes installing a free operating system. Millions of people are choosing the 20 minutes, and every week more are joining them. Let me walk you through exactly how Microsoft created the largest involuntary Linux migration in history, step by step, decision by decision, because the chain of events is so perfectly self-destructive that it almost reads like satire. Step 1, Microsoft released Windows 11 with hardware requirements that excluded roughly 240 million functioning PCs. The TPM 2.0 requirement, the processor generation restrictions, the secure boot mandate. Computers from 2017, 2016, even some from 2018, machines that run every mainstream application without issue, machines that their owners use daily for work, school, communication, and entertainment. Microsoft looked at those machines and said, not good enough. Step 2, Microsoft ended free security support for Windows 10 on October 14, 2025. 400 million people were still using Windows 10 at that point. After that date, no more security patches, no more vulnerability fixes, no more protection against the thousands of new exploits discovered every year. Every unpatched Windows 10 machine became a progressively softer target for automated attacks, ransomware, data theft, and botnet recruitment. Step 3. Microsoft offered a consumer extended security update program for $30, extending basic security patches for 1 additional year until October 13, 2026. 1 year. Not a solution. Delay. A paid pause button that buys 12 months of protection before the same cliff arrives again. And the ESU requires a Microsoft account, naturally, because nothing in Microsoft's ecosystem can exist without funneling you deeper into Microsoft's ecosystem. Step 4. Microsoft aggressively marketed Windows 11 and Copilot Plus PCs as the path forward. Buy new hardware. Get the latest features. Experience AI-powered computing. The messaging was relentless. Upgrade, upgrade, upgrade. The implicit promise was that spending money on new hardware and new software would solve the problem Microsoft had created by abandoning the old hardware and old software. And here is where the chain breaks, because Microsoft's assumption was that the 240 million people whose computers couldn't run Windows 11 would react to this pressure by buying new computers. That was the business model. Create urgency through end of life. Create a hardware barrier through system requirements. Drive a massive upgrade cycle that generates revenue for Microsoft, Intel, AMD, and every OEM manufacturer. But something happened that Microsoft's models didn't predict. The economy in 2025 and 2026 doesn't look like the economy that fueled previous upgrade cycles. Inflation has squeezed household budgets for 3 consecutive years. Consumer electronics spending has stagnated. The average person, the retiree, the student, the small business owner, the parent managing a family budget, does not have $500 to spend on a new laptop because Microsoft decided their current laptop doesn't have the right chip. And at the exact same moment that Microsoft was creating the problem, the solution matured. Not because of Microsoft, despite Microsoft. Linux distributions in 2026 are not what they were 5 or even 3 years ago. Linux Mint 22.3, released in January 2026, shipped with a redesigned application menu, improved hardware compatibility, and a user experience so polished that a Windows user can sit down and start working within minutes. Zorin OS 18.1, released in April 2026, includes a layout switching tool that makes the desktop look identical to Windows 10 or Windows 11 with a single click. It includes a Windows app detection system that covers over 240 applications automatically, suggesting Linux alternatives when a user tries to open a Windows program. Zorin saw 1 million downloads in the 5 weeks after Windows 10's end of support. 1 million in 5 weeks. And then there's the End of 10 campaign, a coordinated multi-organization initiative backed by Debian, Fedora, GNOME, KDE, Zorin OS, and others. The campaign's message is simple. Don't buy a new PC. Revive your current one with Linux. It's fast, secure, and help is available. The campaign connects people with local volunteer groups and repair cafes that help with Linux installations in person. In person. Face-to-face help for people who have never installed an operating system and are nervous about trying. This is the infrastructure that Microsoft's decisions accidentally built demand for, not Linux advocates convincing people to switch through YouTube videos and blog posts. Microsoft itself creating conditions where switching became the most rational, most economical, most practical choice for hundreds of millions of people. The math is brutally simple. Your computer works. Windows 10 is dead. Windows 11 won't install on your hardware. A new computer costs $500. Linux costs $0 and installs in 20 minutes. Your computer runs faster on Linux than it ever did on Windows. Linux receives free security updates for years. No subscription, no mandatory account, no telemetry, no advertisements in the start menu. There is no rational argument against this math for the person sitting in front of an orphaned Windows 10 machine. Every path that keeps them on Windows costs money, time, or security. The only path that costs nothing, loses nothing, and improves performance is Linux. Microsoft didn't recommend Linux. Microsoft didn't endorse Linux. Microsoft made Linux the last option standing for 250 million people, and then removed every other option that didn't involve spending money Microsoft wanted them to spend. The Linux switch isn't optional anymore, not because someone is forcing you to install Linux, because Microsoft eliminated every free, secure, functional alternative for machines that can't run Windows 11. The switch became mandatory the moment Windows 10 died, and Windows 11 refused to run on your hardware. And the people making that switch aren't coming back. Now let me tell you what's happening on the ground, not in tech forums, not in YouTube comment sections, not in the insulated bubble where Linux enthusiasts have been talking to each other for 20 years on the ground, in living rooms and home offices, and school computer labs and community centers and retirement homes and small businesses. Because the Linux migration of 2026 doesn't look like any previous Linux adoption wave. It looks completely different, and the difference is what makes it irreversible. Previous waves of Linux interest were driven by enthusiasm. Someone read an article about open source software. Someone watched a video about privacy. Someone got curious about customization. These were voluntary explorations by people who were attracted to Linux's philosophy or technical capabilities. They were self-selecting. They skewed young, male, technical, and already comfortable with the idea of installing software from a USB drive. The 2026 wave is different. It's driven by necessity. The people switching to Linux right now aren't doing it because they read a manifesto about software freedom. They're doing it because their computer stopped being safe to use and they can't afford a new one. They're retirees on fixed incomes whose 7-year-old laptop does everything they need. They're students whose parents bought them a computer 4 years ago that works perfectly. They're small business owners running a front desk machine that handles appointments and invoices. There are teachers using classroom computers that the school district can't afford to replace. These people don't care about kernel versions. They don't care about desktop environments. They don't care about package managers or rolling releases or the philosophical distinction between free as in beer and free as in freedom. They care about one thing. Does my computer still work? And the answer, thanks to Linux, is yes. The End of 10 campaign understood this audience in a way that the Linux community historically hasn't. The campaign doesn't lead with technical specifications. It leads with a simple message: don't throw away your computer. It directs people to local volunteer groups and repair cafes where real humans help them install Linux in person. Not through a tutorial, not through a video, through face-to-face. Assistance from a neighbor or community volunteer who walks them through the process, answers their questions, and makes sure everything works before they leave. This is how technology adoption actually happens at scale. Not through documentation, not through forums, through trust. Through someone you know, someone in your community, sitting beside you and showing you that the thing you're afraid of isn't actually scary. And the reports coming from these community installations are remarkably consistent. The person arrives nervous. They've used Windows for 15 or 20 years. They've been told their computer is obsolete. They're expecting the Linux installation to be difficult, confusing, and foreign. They're bracing for a painful learning curve. The installation takes 15 to 20 minutes. The desktop appears. It looks familiar. Taskbar at the bottom. Menu in the corner. Icons on the desktop. The volunteer opens Firefox and navigates to the person's email. It works. They open the file manager and show the person their files. Everything is there. They open LibreOffice and create a quick document. It works. They show the person how to install software from the software manager. Click, install, done. And then the person's face changes. The tension dissolves. The nervousness evaporates. Because the thing they were afraid of, the foreign operating system that they imagined would be an impenetrable wall of command lines and error messages, is just a computer. A normal, familiar, usable computer with their files, their browser, their email, their workflow, all working exactly the way they expected. And then they notice something else. The computer is fast, faster than it's been in years. The machine that Windows had convinced them was dying. The machine that took 2 minutes to boot and stuttered through basic tasks now boots in 20 seconds and opens applications instantly. The hardware didn't change. The software changed. And the hardware, freed from the burden of Windows, came back to life. This experience, replicated hundreds of thousands of times across communities worldwide, is creating something that the tech industry has never seen before. A wave of Linux adoption driven not by ideology but by relief. The relief of discovering that your computer isn't broken. The relief of finding that you don't need to spend money you don't have. The relief of realizing that the thing you were told was impossible, using your old computer safely and productively was actually easy. And that relief converts into loyalty with near perfect efficiency. Because the person who switches to Linux out of necessity and discovers that it works better than what they had before doesn't become a reluctant Linux user, waiting for a chance to go back to Windows. They become a permanent Linux user who will never go back because they've experienced the difference. And the difference is overwhelming. The numbers confirm this. Linux desktop market share hit 4.7% in early 2026, the highest it has ever been. Google Trends data showed dramatic spikes in searches for how to install Linux following Windows 10's end of support. Zorin OS recorded 1 million downloads in 5 weeks. Linux Mint's download servers experienced sustained high traffic throughout the post-end-of-life period. These aren't enthusiast numbers. These are mainstream migration numbers. And the growth is self-reinforcing. Every person who switches to Linux and has a positive experience tells someone, their spouse, their neighbor, their colleague at work, their parent, their child. The recommendation carries weight because it comes from a real person with a real experience, not from a tech company's marketing department. Word of mouth is the most powerful adoption driver in technology, and right now, word of mouth is overwhelmingly positive among new Linux converts. But the migration isn't just happening at the individual level, it's happening at the institutional level. And institutional adoption is what transforms a trend into a permanent structural shift. Schools are switching. Districts that deployed hundreds of Windows 10 machines on tight budgets face a choice between replacing those machines and installing Linux. The math isn't complicated. $500 per machine times 300 machines is $150,000. Linux costs nothing. The district installs Linux, keeps the hardware, spends the money on teachers and programs instead of Microsoft licenses and new laptops. Small businesses are switching. A dental office running a reception desk on a Windows 10 machine. An auto repair shop managing invoices on an aging desktop. A freelance accountant using a 5-year-old laptop for client work. Each one facing the same choice. Spend money on new hardware for Windows 11. Or install Linux for free and keep working. For businesses operating on thin margins, the choice makes itself. Nonprofits are switching. Organizations that depend on donated computers, that stretch every dollar, that can't justify spending money on software licenses when that money could fund their mission. Linux gives them secure, supported, functional computers at zero cost. The value proposition isn't competitive, it's categorical. And governments continue switching. Denmark's national migration away from Microsoft. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein state government, replacing Windows with Linux across its administration. France's gendarmerie running tens of thousands of Linux machines. India's Boss Linux for government use. These institutional migrations, already underway before Windows 10's end of life, are accelerating as the practical and economic arguments grow stronger. Each institutional migration produces something that individual switches cannot. Proof at scale, a documented, auditable, publicly visible demonstration that Linux works in production environments, with real users doing real work. When a school district runs Linux on 300 machines for a year without significant issues, that's a case study every other school district can reference. When a government agency runs Linux for a decade and reports cost savings and improved security, that's evidence that enterprise decision makers can cite in their own proposals. The institutional proof creates institutional confidence. Institutional confidence creates institutional adoption. Institutional adoption creates workforce familiarity. Workforce familiarity creates consumer comfort. And consumer comfort feeds back into individual adoption. This is the flywheel. Individual migration and institutional migration reinforcing each other, each one making the other more likely, each one producing evidence that makes the next migration easier to justify, each one adding weight to a momentum that is building faster in 2026 than at any point in Linux's 30-year history. And here's the part that should keep Microsoft strategists awake at night. The flywheel doesn't need external energy to keep spinning. It's powered entirely by Microsoft's own decisions. Every forced update that breaks something pushes people toward Linux. Every advertisement in the Start menu reminds people that alternatives exist. Every arbitrary hardware requirement creates another cohort of orphaned users whose only practical path leads to Linux. Every privacy violation, every telemetry revelation, every recall controversy, every Copilot backlash feeds the narrative that Windows is moving in a direction that serves Microsoft at the expense of its users. Microsoft is generating its own competition, not through failure, through success, through successfully implementing a strategy of maximum data extraction, maximum ecosystem lock-in, maximum subscription conversion, and maximum hardware gatekeeping. Every one of these strategies is working exactly as designed, and every one of them is pushing users toward the one alternative that does none of these things. The Linux switch didn't become mandatory because Linux advocates won an argument. It became mandatory because Microsoft won an argument with itself about how aggressively it could monetize its user base, and the answer turned out to be aggressive enough that millions of people would rather install a completely different operating system than continue accepting the terms. Now let me address the question that is forming in the mind of every person watching this who hasn't switched yet. The question isn't whether Linux works. At this point, the evidence is overwhelming. The question is what specifically happens when you make the switch. Not theoretically, practically. What does day one look like? What does week one feel like? What breaks? What doesn't? What surprises you? What disappoints you? What makes you wonder why you didn't do this years ago? I'm going to walk through the complete reality of switching, including the parts that aren't perfect. Because honesty about the rough edges is more useful than pretending they don't exist. Because the rough edges, when you actually encounter them, turn out to be far less significant than the smooth surfaces you gain. Day one begins with a choice of distribution. For anyone coming from Windows 10 whose primary goal is continuity, minimal disruption, and maximum familiarity, the choice is between Linux Mint and Zorin OS. I'm going to describe both because they solve the transition problem differently, and the right choice depends on what kind of person you are. Linux Mint is the recommendation for people who want a computer that works and who never want to think about the operating system again. It installs quickly, configures itself sensibly, and presents a desktop that Windows users navigate intuitively from the first minute. The Cinnamon desktop environment has a taskbar at the bottom, a menu in the corner, a system tray with familiar icons, and a file manager that works exactly the way File Explorer works. The resemblance isn't accidental. It's designed to minimize the cognitive distance between what you're used to and what you're looking at. Zorin OS is the recommendation for people who want the transition to feel invisible. Zorin 18.1's appearance tool lets you switch the entire desktop layout to match Windows 10, Windows 11, or Mac OS with a single click. But Zorin goes further. Its Windows App Detection System recognizes over 240 Windows applications. When you try to open a Windows program that doesn't exist on your system, Zorin identifies the program, suggests the best native Linux alternative, and offers to install it. This feature alone eliminates one of the biggest friction points in any operating system transition, the moment where you reach for a familiar tool and discover it's not there. The installation process itself is nearly identical for both distributions. You download an ISO file from the official website, you burn it to a USB drive using a free tool, you boot from the USB. And this is where something important happens before you install anything. Both Linux Mint and Zorin OS run a complete live session from the USB drive. You get a fully functional desktop, a working browser, a working file manager, access to your Wi-Fi, and the ability to test everything before you commit. Your hard drive is untouched. Windows is still sitting there, completely unmodified. You're test driving the operating system with zero risk. During the live session, test the things that matter to you. Does your Wi-Fi connect? Does your Bluetooth work? Does your printer respond? Does your external monitor display at the right resolution? Does your webcam function? Does the trackpad feel right? These hardware compatibility questions, which used to be genuine concerns 5 years ago, now resolve positively for the vast majority of mainstream laptops and desktops. But testing before installing eliminates uncertainty entirely. If everything works in the live session, you double-click the install icon. The installer walks you through language, time zone, keyboard layout, and username creation. It offers a critical choice: install alongside Windows or replace. Windows entirely. If you're nervous, choose alongside. This creates a dual boot configuration where every time you turn on your computer, a menu asks which operating system you want to load. You can use Linux for daily tasks while keeping Windows available as a safety net. Over time, as you realize that Linux handles everything you need, the safety net becomes unnecessary, but having it there eliminates the fear of commitment that keeps many people from switching. The installation takes 15 to 20 minutes. When it finishes, you reboot. The desktop appears. Your computer is running Linux. And here's where the experience diverges from what most people expect. The expectation, built from years of Linux stereotypes, is that something will be hard, something will require a command line, something will break, something will demand technical knowledge you don't have. And for the vast majority of mainstream users doing mainstream tasks, none of this happens. You open Firefox and browse the web. You check email. You open LibreOffice and write a document. You watch a video on YouTube. You manage files in the file manager. Everything works. Everything is fast. Everything is where you expect it to be. The first surprise isn't that something is hard. The first surprise is that nothing is hard. The second surprise is that your computer is faster than you've experienced in years. Now let me talk about what isn't perfect. Because pretending Linux has no rough edges would be dishonest, and dishonesty would disserve every person considering this switch. Printing can occasionally require extra steps. Most common printers from HP, Canon, Epson, and Brother work automatically when connected. Some printers, particularly multifunction devices with scanning capabilities, may need a driver package installed from the manufacturer's website or from the distribution's driver manager. This process is usually straightforward, but occasionally requires a few minutes of setup that Windows handled automatically through its larger driver database. Some very specific professional software doesn't run natively on Linux. Adobe Creative Suite is the most commonly cited example. Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, After Effects, these applications don't have Linux versions. For people whose livelihood depends specifically on Adobe products, this is a genuine constraint. Alternatives exist. GIMP for image editing, Inkscape for vector graphics, DaVinci Resolve for professional video editing, which runs natively on Linux and is used by professional filmmakers, Kdenlive for lighter video editing, Blender for 3D work. But alternatives require workflow adaptation, and workflow adaptation takes time and effort. Some anti-cheat systems in competitive multiplayer games don't support Linux. If you play a specific competitive title that uses kernel-level anti-cheat like Vanguard, check ProtonDB before switching. The list of incompatible games shrinks every month as developers and anti-cheat providers add Linux support, but it's not yet universal. These are real limitations. They affect real people, and they deserve honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal, but they also deserve proportional context. For every one person whose daily workflow genuinely requires Adobe Photoshop, there are 40 people who use their computer for browsing, email, documents, media consumption, and light gaming. For those 40 people, every single thing they do works on Linux without compromise. And here's the context that changes the proportional calculation entirely. The rough edges of Linux are static limitations with known boundaries. You can check before switching whether your specific printer works, whether your specific software has a Linux version, whether your specific games are compatible. The information is available, documented, and verifiable. You can make an informed decision based on your specific situation. The rough edges of staying on Windows are dynamic degradations with no boundaries. You don't know what the next update will break. You don't know what the next feature addition will surveil. You don't know what default the next patch will change. You don't know what the next terms of service revision will authorize. The problems aren't fixed constraints you can plan around. They're moving targets that change with every update cycle. Choosing between a system with known static limitations and a system with unknown, escalating degradations isn't a close call. It's not even a real comparison. One gives you a clear picture of what works and what doesn't. The other gives you a monthly lottery where the prizes are broken drivers, reset defaults, new advertisements, and expanded surveillance. And this is why the mandatory nature of this migration matters so much. Because Microsoft didn't just force people to consider Linux. They forced people to compare Linux against the current state of Windows. And in that comparison, Linux wins on every dimension that matters to everyday users. Speed, stability, privacy, cost, longevity, respectfulness, simplicity, trust. Windows wins on software compatibility for specific professional niches. That's it. That's the entire list of categories where Windows maintains a meaningful advantage over Linux for mainstream use cases. One category, against 8. Microsoft made this comparison mandatory for 240 million people. And the comparison favors Linux so overwhelmingly that the only mystery is why it took this long for the migration to reach this scale. The answer, of course, is that people never made the comparison before. They never had to. Windows was the default. Windows was pre-installed. Windows was what everyone else used. Windows was the only option most people knew existed. The comparison never happened because one side of the comparison was invisible. Microsoft made Linux visible, not through endorsement, through elimination. By killing Windows 10 and locking Windows 11 behind a hardware wall, they forced hundreds of millions of people to look at what was on the other side of that wall. And what they found was an operating system that works better, costs nothing, respects their privacy, extends the life of their hardware, and never once shows them an advertisement in their start menu. Microsoft made the Linux switch mandatory. And the people who are making that switch are discovering that mandatory might have been the best thing that ever happened to them. Their computers work again. Their batteries last longer. Their fans stay quiet. Their files stay private. Their settings stay unchanged. Their attention stays uninterrupted. And their operating system, for the first time in a decade, works for them instead of against them. Microsoft didn't mean to do any of this. They meant to sell new computers. They meant to drive Windows 11 adoption. They meant to push people deeper into the Microsoft ecosystem. Instead, they pushed millions of people out of it entirely. And every single one of those people landed somewhere better. Whether Microsoft likes it or not, the switch they made mandatory is the best upgrade most of these people have ever received. And it didn't cost them a cent.